Well, good evening. I am JD with the Astronomers of Verde Valley, and you'll notice I look like I have a little bit of a fever tonight, but that's not illness. That is a red light. I'm in my own personal observatory here, and we're going to look at some things in the night sky. And one of the reasons for the red light is to help my eyes keep dark adapted so I can kind of see what's going on, as well as most astronomers use an orange or red lights when they read or such. So, pretty much everyone knows, everything's been kind of shut down. Astronomy is a very, very social event. So, those have all been canceled for this year. We're hoping to get back to doing our star parties and astronomy programs next year. But in the meantime, we decided to try something a little different, a virtual star party, whereas we will you'll look at your screen and I'll actually go to different objects in the night sky and take a short image of that, and then it'll show up on my screen and I can talk a little bit about it. So in the early stages here, we're just is this going to be a program only, and there will not be any feedback or questions asked at this time. But maybe we'll figure that out one of these days and be able to have a live event where you can text in or email in your questions. So if we'll go to our screen share, I think we're doing that possibly pretty quickly here. You'll see a screen show up with a picture, and just below the center of the picture is a small green smudge. And I took this actually a few minutes ago. This is called Comet Howell 88P. This was discovered in 1981 by a young astronomer by the name of Ellen Howell. And she had just went into her astronomy programs and happened to discover this. And it has a period or an orbit around the sun of about once every 5.5 years. So that means that we can only see it well about once every 5 years, or I'm sorry, once every 11 years, when it actually is at its closest pass to the Earth. So that little tiny green smudge there. Hopefully you'll be able to see my mouse circling it. It was just getting ready to set behind my house, so I had to take a picture of it beforehand to show you that small little green smudge. It'll be visible throughout September and maybe a little bit into October. So if you have a chance, go to NASA website or just type in Comet Howell 88P, and you'll be able to find out where you'll be able to see this, or pick up one of the September issues of an astronomy magazine, and that'll probably have information on how to view it and where to view it. It's right now in the constellation of Scorpio or Scorpius, the Scorpion, and it will be passing right through the heart or pretty close to the heart of the Scorpion over the next couple of weeks. So now I've already slewed over to our next photo op, and I'll go ahead and take a picture of that. I'm taking a 30-second exposure with a wide field telescope setup. And for you photographers, the F ratio is f1.9, and my focal length's about 700 millimeters. The unique thing about this lens is it's 14 inches in diameter, so it gathers quite a bit of light. So after the 30-second exposure, you will see it pop up. And I just heard the shutter close, and there we have. And notice it looks a little bit red. So when I take the next shot of it, and I'll go ahead and turn off my red light here, and I'll use my directional light, will give us a little better view. But this is actually two galaxies right here, just above center of the picture. And there's a smaller galaxy and a larger galaxy, and they've been merging for about the last 200 million years, and probably will take another 200 million years for them to form one larger galaxy. This is called the Whirlpool Galaxy. It's located in the constellation of Canis Venatici, the hunting dogs. And the shutter just went off. And there you'll see a much nicer picture of this galaxy. You can see the spiral arms and even some of the material right there where the mouse is being taken from the smaller galaxy and getting absorbed into the larger galaxy. This also is a Charles Messier object and has the Messier number of 51. So this is called M51 for Charles Messier. He was a comet hunter in the mid 1700s. And while hunting comets, he found a lot of these objects that appeared initially as comets, but because they were fixed in the sky, they didn't move night to night. He figured out that, well, they were not comets because comets move through our solar system pretty quickly and are only usually visible for a short period of time, just like the one I had showed you earlier, which had a period of 5.5 years. Another thing about this galaxy, it's 27 million light years away. So in other words, the light that we just absorbed through the telescope into the camera left this galaxy about 27 million years ago and just got here tonight. So that's some pretty large distances between us and this particular galaxy. Now, when you look at different textbooks and depending on their age, when they were printed, you'll see that this particular galaxy, M51, the Whirlpool Galaxy, may have some distance measurements anywhere from 20 million light years up to about 37 million light years. And a couple of years ago, at an astronomical conference, they did some research on it and pretty much agreed that it's about 27 million light years away, give or take, say 3 or 4 million light years. So it's a fairly close by galaxy as the size of the universe goes, but it's still quite a ways out there. But it's really nice in the telescope. You have a chance to come to our astronomy program, take a look at it if it's up in the sky at that time. And pretty much what you see on the picture is what you'll be able to see actually visually. So I'm going to go over to the next object now. Here, let me look at my list. And I'll slew the telescope over there. We're going to another M object or Messier object. And this will be a globular cluster of stars. Globular clusters are very, very dense, compact areas in the sky and have anywhere from 100,000 up to several million stars. This particular object, M92, is located in the constellation of Hercules. And it happens to be about 26,000 light years away. This will be in the Milky Way. But globular clusters reside in the outer halo, kind of the suburbs of the Milky Way. So they're on the outer fringes. And typically most of them are fairly far away. We'll maybe look at a couple that are a bit closer later tonight. So as you'll see as the picture refreshes here, whoops, there's a little bit of movement there. Took the picture a little fast. This is a 20-second exposure. But you'll notice that big haze of stars right below center. That is the globular cluster. Now, just in about another 4 or 5 seconds, as you'll see, the picture will refresh. You'll see a little better picture of it. And there we go, much better. You can see the spread of stars. So these are quite fascinating to look at through a telescope. And seems like the longer you look at them, the more detail you see and the more stars that you'll see. Now, this is a fairly popular object to view through the telescope. There's only about 200 of them that have been discovered in the Milky Way. So there's not a lot of them out there considering the number of stars and the number of other clusters that we'll look at in a bit, and I'll tell you the difference when we get to those. So I'll go over to another cluster very nearby. That's another globular cluster, and this is one of the most popular globular clusters in the Northern Hemisphere to look at, and it's called the Great Hercules Cluster. It has a Messier number of 13. And this particular cluster, when it pops up, you'll see quite a difference in the size and the number of stars. And whereas M92 has probably a couple of 100,000 stars, this M13 that's going to come up on the screen in a few seconds has nearly 1 million stars, if not over 1 million stars. So there you'll see it. It's quite a bit larger on the screen and cover up a much larger area, but it's just absolutely beautiful to look at through a telescope. Very, very nice and very, very bright. The M92, the prior globular cluster, was about 26,000 light years away, and M13 is somewhere between 22 and 25,000 light years away. So it's a little bit closer, but a lot more stars, and as you can see, it's quite the sight to see. Now, if we go over here and see where my small mouse is circling, there's actually a very small galaxy right there. See that little tiny sliver? Almost looks like an out of focus star. That is actually another galaxy, and this one's very, very far away. I haven't looked at the distances, but I'm guessing it's 60 to 70 million light years away, so much farther than the Whirlpool galaxy we looked at just a few minutes ago. So we'll look at a few more globulars here in a little bit, but we're going to go over to a really nice bright star now called Vega. And Vega is one of our closer stars. And of course, it is in the Milky Way. Now, Vega is a fairly bright star, so I'm going to have to shorten my exposures quite a bit. And even went down to a 4-second exposure. And even that might be a little bit of a long exposure for this really bright star. And there you'll see it below center there. Notice the colors were very, very blue. Typically, a blue star indicates a fairly young star. This one's about 25 light years away and has what's called 2.5 solar masses. So the weight of the star is about 2.5 times that of our sun. Typically, the bluer stars are only burning hydrogen, and that hence the blue color. But they do burn hydrogen at a pretty ferocious rate, so they may not live near as long as our own sun. Our sun in particular is about 4.5 billion years old. And some of the younger stars, possibly like Vega, may only live a few 100 million years until they run out of fuel. And once they run out of fuel, you've probably heard the term supernova. And the next object we're going to go is fairly near Vega. And it has another Messier object. And the reason we look at Messier objects is Charles Messier, back in the mid-1700s, was using a very, very small telescope, just a few inches in diameter, and he discovered all of these objects, and particularly they're fairly easily seen in small telescopes, and with some of the bigger telescopes, they even show up much, much better. So even a 4 or 5 inch telescope, you'll be able to see most of these objects we're looking at tonight. And don't forget about binoculars. Many of these objects, if not all these objects we're looking at tonight, will be seen through some nice binoculars. You might have to use a tripod to keep them steady, or lean up against a wall. But there in this poster, you'll see this looks like a little blue round circle, and it also has a little small fringe around it of red. This is called the Ring Nebula, and this is what happens when a star ends its life. The stars start cooling off and swelling up, and then in the blink of an eye, they collapse, and then the rebound of the collapse ejects all the gas out into space, and then the collapsed star irradiates the escaping gas and causes it to glow. So this is actually called a planetary nebula. Now, it has nothing to do with planets, but when the first astronomers discovered them, there again in the 1800s, they appeared very, very planet-like, although they didn't move as the planets move in the sky. They were eventually described as nebulous once larger telescopes were built, and then they were able to see actually some nebulosity in them. So the name kind of stuck, Planetary Nebula. But this particular one, I believe, is about around 1,000 years, maybe a little farther. There again, depending on the text you use, might have it a little closer or a little farther. But quite a unique object to look at in the telescope. This is one of the fewer objects that you're able to see color. Now, the red ring that's around it that you can kind of make out, hopefully you can make out on your computer screen or TV screen there, will not be able to be seen visually. The eye is not very sensitive to the far red spectrum, but the blue core of it shows up really nicely bluish in most telescopes anywhere from 4 inches up. So it's a very, very unique object to have a look at. So we'll have a look at another one of these that is similar but much different. Oh, by the way, Vega and also the Ring Nebula here, M57, is located in a constellation of Lyra the Harp, just for those keeping track of your constellations tonight. So the next object we'll look at is a planetary nebula. It's much larger in size, but when viewed through the telescope, you just see a gray smudge. You really don't see any of the color in it like you would on the Ring Nebula. And this one happens to be called the Dumbbell Nebula. It's almost round, but if you look really, really closely, you can kind of see it has some shape to it, and someone decided that it looked like a dumbbell. And here it's getting ready to pop up, and there you notice it. Yeah, a little bit of scope movement. But as you can see the blues here. There again, this will be just mostly gray in the telescope, but it almost looks like an apple core. I guess you could maybe even call it the Apple Core Nebula if you'd like. But that's a fairly close object at about, I think it's roughly about 1,000 light years away. You'll see in some text that'll be listed as close as 700 light years away. But this is what our sun is going to do in about 4 billion years or so. So we're not set our day quite yet. All right, so one thing I didn't mention is the camera I'm using is a Canon camera. And the Canon cameras, and as well as most cameras that are color, will pick up the subtle colors that you see, but the eye is just not sensitive enough to pick up those colors. So we're moving just a little bit, and actually we're going over to another globular cluster. And I'll shorten the exposure a little bit here. This is another Messier object. It's one of our closer globular clusters. I show the charts say that it's about 12,000 light years away, so it's pretty close, but much, much farther than, say, this particular. Typically, most of the planetary nebulas, exploded stars that we see will be fairly close by. As you can see, the little fuzzy area right down here almost looks like a little spider web of stars here. And there again, that is another globular cluster. And I think I mentioned this one's 12,000 light years away. So now we're going to take a look at what's called open clusters. Now, open clusters are much different. And as the name implies, they are open. Whereas globular clusters are basically globs of stars. The open clusters are fairly loosely bound together stars. In fact, our sun at one time, 4 billion years ago when it was formed in an open cluster. A big, huge hydrogen cloud formed probably a couple of hundred stars, and our sun was one of those. Now, globular clusters are very, very old. Most globular clusters are maybe up to 10 billion years old, where open clusters are fairly young, maybe only a few million years old. So we're going to see that pop up really quick here. And there we go. A little fast on the shutter. As you can see, this really bright concentration of slightly moving stars, and it'll refresh here in another 20 seconds. This particular cluster is fairly close, only about 15 to 1600 light years away. So your globular clusters will be roughly 10,000 light years away and farther. Most of the open clusters we will see are much, much closer, anywhere from 400 light years away up to a couple of thousand light years away. So that gold star here, that may be a foreground star, maybe not necessarily associated with this cluster. But this is called an open cluster. Basically, as you can see, there's a lot of space in between them. They're not quite tightly packed like the globular cluster. Now, this is also a really, really nice binocular object. In fact, as you see my mouse kind of circle around, that's about the size of the moon. So this cluster is actually a little bit larger than, say, a full moon. And it makes a very nice binocular object, but right next to it is somewhat of a twin to it, and it has a Messier number 7. Actually, see clusters in the same field of view, so it makes it very, very nice to see through binoculars. And if you look just off the tail of the scorpion, if you know where Scorpio is, look just off the tail of the scorpion, and you'll be able to see these two clusters. Now, you'll notice the density of stars really increased over that other object, as we're getting closer to the stars in the Milky Way. But this is called Messier number 7. And even you can see some dark nebulas here. This is interstellar dust that will cause dark regions, basically just hiding the stars that are behind it. And there are some astronomers that spend their entire careers studying these dark nebulas and such. So they're fairly interesting to see. A little bit tough to see in some telescopes. If you have a really dark sky and some pretty well dark adapted eyes, you'll be able to see these in a telescope. But we're going to be mostly concentrating on the brighter objects, the Messier objects tonight. So this is called Messier number 7. And also it has the name, the Ptolemy's cluster. It's about 1,000 light years away. So there again, if you look off just off the tail of the scorpion, you'll be able to see two little smudges with your naked eye. You wouldn't even have to have binoculars. You'll be able to see these fairly well. So we're going to shift gears a little bit here and go to a nebula, but there's also a cluster associated with this particular nebula. And this is called the Lagoon Nebula. Mostly known for its nebulosity, but it does have an embedded star cluster. One of our closer star-forming regions, I believe it's about 5,000 light years away. On my list here, it says it's 4,000 light years away, so it's fairly close, a little farther than the cluster we just said. As you can see, the picture pops up. It's very colorful, and the color almost overshadows the stars. Now, there we go. And that was a 30-second exposure. Now you'll look in the center right here, you'll see the stars embedded there within the nebula. And those are the stars that are being formed by this really massive cloud of hydrogen gas collapsing and forming these stars. Now, if I go to a monochrome view of this and shorten the exposure a bit, I can pretty much give you an indication of exactly what it may look like. I'm down to a 10-second exposure, and there's pretty much what it'll look like in the telescope. You'll see the stars much better, and you'll see this little thick nebulosity right here through the telescope. If you look at it and think of these two stars as eyes, and here's a little round circle of stars, I kind of call it the Michelin Man cluster. He's a little upside down. Through many telescopes, my telescopes anyway, he will be standing right side up. But that's pretty much the view that you'll have actually through the telescope. And everyone always likes color, so we'll go back to maybe some color here and take a look at it once again with a little bit of longer exposure. But there's a lot of dark nebulosity in this picture as well. But this huge cloud of hydrogen spreads quite a large area in the sky. In fact, there again, if you have a nice dark sky and some pretty good dark adapted eyes, you'll actually be able to see this with the naked eye, and definitely see it through binoculars. But you can see some of those darker areas. Dark nebulas. This is truly a fine object also to take a picture of. So we'll continue on. Not far from this Lagoon Nebula is another nebula with a cluster embedded in it. And this is called the Trifid Nebula. I have my pet name for it. I like to call it the Mad Cat Nebula. And there again, this particular nebula will be bluish as well as has just a little red. Typically, the red nebulas, like the Lagoon Nebula here, are known as emission nebulas. So the stars being born there are illuminating the hydrogen in the red wavelengths. Sometimes when you have bright blue stars outside of a nebula, they will reflect off the nebula and give that blue color, which you'll be able to see some blue color right here in this particular nebula. So there's the little blue reflection nebula, and then here's the emission nebula. Now, if you have quite the imagination, you can see the eyes of the cat, the mouth of the cat, and the little white nose of the cat. So I always call that the Mad Cat Nebula. It's kind of an interesting to look through. It looks like there's also another small open cluster right over here on this side of it. But given the proximity to the Lagoon Nebula, if I were to move the telescope and put the nebula over on the left side, we can actually photograph both nebulas at the same time. So depending on the telescope that you're looking through, some may give you a wider field of view, some may give you a much narrower field of view. So as we move along, we'll go over to another object in Sagittarius. And we'll be looking at several objects here in the Sagittarius region. And don't want to bore you with too many globular clusters, but this particular globular cluster is one of our closer clusters, globular clusters. It's just above the asymptote of Sagittarius and is quite fascinating to examine in the telescope. There again, it's almost a naked eye object as a fuzzy star. Binoculars bring it in fairly well. And as you will see, the telescope brings it in extremely well. But this particular cluster, there it is only about 10,000 light years away, somewhere between 9,500 light years and 10,000 light years away. There again, notice all the background stars. So it's in the stream of stars in the Milky Way. So there are some estimates on stars in the Milky Way, and I've heard estimates anywhere from 300 billion up to 500 billion stars. So a lot of stars in the Milky Way, and this is just a few of them. Even though you would think there's thousands of stars in this picture, there's a lot more where those came from. But to find this, take a look up in the sky. Right now, it's in the southern sky. And you'll see the asterism, the teapot. It actually looks like a teapot, has a handle, the spout and such. And if you look just off the top left of the top of the cap of the teapot, the lid of the teapot, you'll be able to see this little small smudgy area, and that is called M22, or the Sagittarius globular cluster. Now we'll go over to some more nebulous regions here. And we could spend pretty much all night long looking at objects just in a very, very small spot of the sky here, because the Sagittarius and Scorpius regions and just above it are just full of objects, clusters, globular clusters, nebulas, the list goes on and on. So what we're going to have a look at now is called the Swan Nebula. And this is actually a star-forming region, but we're not able to see the stars that are being formed as we did with, say, the Lagoon Nebula. These particular stars are embedded in the cloud of hydrogen, and we can basically see this cloud of hydrogen that, if you have a good enough imagination, looks very, very much like a swan. And we'll see what it looks like here. There we go. The swan is diving. So here you can see the neck and head of the swan, and then the body of the swan right here, and his wings. And of course has all this nebulosity around it. There again, if I take a monochrome picture of it, it will pretty much be exactly what you would be able to see in a small telescope. And whereas I have a computerized telescope that zips around the Milky Way finding these objects, if you have a star chart, and most of the astronomy magazines online will provide you with most star charts, you'll be able to what's called star hop over to all these objects. They'll give you a main bright visual star that you can see. You'll throw your telescope on that, and then once you find that in your telescope, you'll hop or move your scope gently over, and then you'll find the object that you're wanting to view. So here's pretty much what it looks like in the telescope without the color. There again, the eye is not that sensitive to the red spectrum, so it's not going to show up too much there. But this is called the Swan. Now, they were able to find that this was a star-forming nebula by using infrared photography and infrared telescopes. And the infrared telescopes and cameras can peer beyond the cloud of hydrogen there and see what's inside. And that's when they discovered that there's roughly 1,000 or more stars in this particular nebulous region being formed. And let's see. Now, as you may have heard the telescope move, it didn't move very far. We're went over actually to what's called the Eagle Nebula. Now, this particular nebula is kind of what put the Hubble Space Telescope in the forefront in front of the people around the world. This is one of the most famous pictures of the Hubble Space Telescope. Of course, I don't have the Hubble Space Telescope, so it's not going to look quite the same. My image scale will be much smaller. Maybe see if you can get really close to your screen, you'll be able to see the eagle in it. So there we have the eagle right where my mouse is. You can see it right there. It's very, very small. There again, the Hubble Space Telescope zooms in pretty good. It has a very, very small field of view on some of their cameras. So they see that area right there. There again has an embedded cluster also around it. But that right there is the Eagle Nebula. Now you notice it appears red, but if you look at the Hubble Space Telescope picture, it won't look like that at all. They use what's called fall color, is known as the Hubble color palette, where they assign different wavelengths of filters to the RGB or red, green, and blue palette when they combine the picture, each individual picture taken with a different filter, into the RGB using, say, a Photoshop or an astronomy photo program. But if you look very, very closely, you can see right there is the Eagle Nebula. There again, this particular picture is pretty much what you would see in your telescope when we actually view it. There again, the red kind of escapes our view a little bit. So we'll be going over next to another open cluster. And I've mentioned several names, and a lot of these clusters like the Eagle Nebula and such, the names have kind of caught on over the years, and they've actually made them somewhat official. So we're going to have a look now at the Wild Duck cluster. So let me turn back on my standard picture. There we go. Oh, notice that little streak that just showed up when I took another image of the monochrome here. That little streak could be a Starlink satellite. I'm not sure. I would have to go to my satellite online catalog to see what satellites were going over at this particular time. But that is one of the problems with too many satellites in the sky going through scientific images as we have here. So they can be removed with some astronomy programs, but it would be much easier if they weren't there. But with the several thousand Starlink satellites that are being launched, eventually they're going to cause a few issues, and we're trying to figure out some ways to maybe minimize the process time and hopefully help the astronomers have the proper pictures. So let's see here. We should be getting a picture. Let's see. Here pretty quick. A small technical difficulty. Let's wait till this occurs. So my picture is done, and then we'll see. Oh, there we go. Now we can move again. Oh, there we go. There's the cluster showed up. So this is called the wild duck cluster. Pretty dense there again in the stream of stars in the Milky Way. You're able to see some dark nebulosity around it. But this almost looks like a globular cluster, but it's just a very, very dense open cluster area that you can see here. But really nice binocular object. Don't, if you have a really dark sky and some sharp eyes, you might glimpse it with averted vision with your eyes, but maybe not. It definitely shows up nicely in binoculars. And I will mention averted vision for a moment, since I happen to. Averted vision is when you look directly at an object, it seems to go away or disappear. When you look away from your eyes or tilt your head a little bit, the object will pop into view. It's called averted vision. Many times when you look through a telescope, you maybe not see anything, but if you are patient enough and move your eyes around a little bit, look to the right, look to the left of the object, it will pop into view. And that's a pretty important technique to use when looking through telescopes. And it's called averted vision. So the next time you're out looking through a telescope and you're not able to see the object, but the astronomer at the telescope says, yep, it's there, try that averted vision technique, and hopefully it'll pop into view for you. And the wild duck cluster is about 6,000 light years away. So with our given technology that we have today, it will take a few 100,000 years to get there. I don't know we'll be going there anytime soon. And we have some more open clusters to view. This is another Messier object. It's called M18, and it's an open cluster. And I believe this one, I didn't make a note of it on my sheet here, but I believe this one has a nickname of the nebula, I believe. To double check. And most of these objects were linked, if you just open your Google or your search engine and type in globular cluster, say M13 or M92, or say Swan Nebula M17, you'll be able to pull those up and do some research and study, see what their distances are, what their size is, how many stars that are in their particular region. So here you'll see this is a fairly large open cluster here. A little bit of nebulosity, not too much that can be seen visually. Oh, there's a little, but if you look over on the left side of the screen, there is some nebulosity there, but not associated with this particular star cluster right here in front of us. And this cluster is about 6,000 light years away, so fairly close there again, considering the distances of the Milky Way. There are some clusters, globular clusters that we can see in the Milky Way that are over 100,000 light years away. But they're very, very faint, very small, but they're kind of interesting to view as well, just because they are so far away. Whoops, if I happen to do some swatting, it's there's a few bugs kind of coming around here. I'm not sure if you can see. That looks like a little dragonfly coming, trying to do a little stargazing with us tonight. So let's see. Seems like summertime is the time to view globular clusters. So we'll have another look at another Messier object. This one is Messier 54, a globular cluster located in the Sagittarius region. Sagittarius is actually the Archer or the Minotaur. And there again, most people know the asterism, the grouping of stars within Sagittarius, as the teapot. And we have a small globular here. This one is pretty far away. It shows to be over 80,000 light years away. So it's almost on the other side of the Milky Way from us. Notice the number of stars in the background have thinned out a bit. So the telescope has moved off of the rift of stars through the center of the Milky Way, and now we're looking at kind of the edge of the thick part of the stars through the Milky Way. So as you get farther and farther out towards the edge of the Milky Way, the stars will become thinner and thinner. So at this time of year, when we look to the south, we're looking towards the center of the Milky Way. And in fact, if you look at the teapot asterism of Sagittarius and find the spout pulls right out to the center or heart of our Milky Way. And that's where the very, very thick stream of stars will continue northerly. And then if you want to get up about 4 tomorrow morning or stay up all night and have a look at Orion as it comes up, Orion has some fairly bright stars that are easily seen. But when you take a picture of the area, you will not have the concentration of stars that we see here. So the Orion constellation is looking out towards the edges of the Milky Way. So the stars are much less populated in the outer regions or the edges of the Milky Way. So it's a good comparison over one night's time to see all the dense stars in the Milky Way, and then to have a look at Orion in the morning to see the stars have thinned out quite a bit. So this globular must be pretty big to be over 8,000 years away, and it does appear pretty bright. So there again, a very, very nice globular cluster to view through the telescope. Binoculars, it's going to look pretty much like a fuzzy little star. So the smaller ones are a little tough in binoculars. So another globular we'll have a look at is quite a bit closer. And it is about 17,000 light years away, almost next door. And keep in mind the Milky Way is over 100,000 light years. So if we were able to travel the speed of light, it would take us over 100,000 years to go across it. Oh, let me take a look where my telescope is pointed. And I think we've encountered what's affectionately called the tree nebula. I have a palm tree not far from the observatory, and I believe we have found this cluster to be right behind the trees. So we'll have to come back to that maybe in a little bit to check it out. But we only have a few 100,000 more objects to go to, so we'll take a look at another one here. And we'll see if this one's out from behind the tree. That's one of the reasons they put telescopes on mountains, is they don't have to worry too much about light pollution for one, but they don't have to worry too much about the surrounding trees and such, kind of like we do in our urban areas here. There we go. This is another globular cluster. I'm sure by now you've seen enough globular that you have a telescope. You'll be able to identify those. There again, notice the background stars are much thicker. So we're nearing that rift of thick stars and towards the center line of the Milky Way. This globular cluster is known as M70, and it's about almost 30,000 light years away. So they're again next door, but it would take us a while to get there by bus for sure. And even with a spacecraft traveling at 100,000 miles an hour, it would take us many, many thousands of years to reach our destination. So now we will take a look at something we haven't yet seen tonight. And that's called a double star. This particular, there's a couple of kinds of double stars. Some are optical doubles, as this one is, and some are what's called binary doubles. The binary double stars will actually orbit each other, whereas the visual doubles are just stars that just happen to be in the same area and not necessarily orbiting each other. This particular one's called Alberio. It's the eyes of the swan. So if you look right overhead, you'll be able to see Cygnus the swan this time of night. And that was a 6-second exposure, a little too long, so I'm going to shorten the exposure up to 2 seconds. And that's even a little bit too long, so we'll go down to 1 second. So as you can see, stars really saturate the chips as well. So if you look right there, you'll see 2 stars there. You'll see a reddish star and then also a bluish star. So that's hence why they call them the eyes of the swan. So if you find the Cygnus the swan, which is also known as the Northern Cross, right overhead at about 9 or 10 o'clock at night, you'll see a big diamond shape or square of stars, and then look out way towards the end, and then you will find these eyes. Visually, they can just be seen as one star, but when you train your telescope or binoculars on them, I believe binoculars might be able to see this as a double star, but definitely the telescope shows it very well. And another unique thing about this pair of stars is one is blue and one is orange or red in color, which makes them really, really pretty in the telescope to observe. But this one's called an optical double. It hasn't been proven yet to be a binary double. But both the stars seem to be about the same distance from Earth. As memory serves me, I believe these are about 400 light years away, which is about the same distance as Polaris, our North Star. And Polaris, our North Star, by the way, is actually a binary double. It has a star that does orbit it. And there are also multiple star systems that can orbit each other. So you can have one or two or three or four, and sometimes even more stars that are in somewhat of a dance in the sky that actually orbit around each other. So we're going to vary away from the Messier catalog just a moment and go over to what's called the NGC, or New General Catalog Object. So several years ago, I was watching a supernova in a small constellation called Delphinus the Dolphin. And the supernova brightened to naked eye visibility pretty quickly over a one night's period of time, and stayed visually visible. In other words, you didn't need binoculars or a telescope to see it for a couple of weeks, and then it started dimming down a bit, and it had a couple of flare-ups as well. But in my wide field telescope here that I use, I noticed this little tiny blue dot, and I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. I wonder what that is. And it was actually a small planetary nebula. So if you look right here where my mouse is going around, below center of the picture, that is actually a small planetary nebula. And it's roughly about 7,000 light years away, but it's very, very bright blue. And it actually shows up just as a tinge of blue when you look at it through the telescope. So it's very unique indeed. And that supernova I was observing, let me see if I can find the keystone stars. There was a circlet of stars. Of course, in this particular picture, there's a lot of circlet stars right there. But this nova went off, and it was able to be seen telescopically for about a year, and then it pretty much disappeared. Now, for that nova that blew up, which was a collapsed star, very similar to this small blue dot here, takes a few hundred years for after a star has went nova or supernova for it to become large enough to be seen in small telescopes or visually. So like the Ring Nebula, the Dumbbell Nebula and such, we have to wait a while. One particular nebula that probably the most well-known exploded star was back in the year 1054, and it was in the constellation of Cancer. I'm sorry, no, it wasn't in Cancer the Crab. It was in Taurus, maybe. But the nebula eventually became the Crab Nebula. But the star exploded in 1054, but was not discovered until mid-1700s. There again, Charles Messier identified it as his first object, or M1, and it's called the Crab Nebula. But it took nearly 700 years for that gas cloud to expand enough to see it telescopically. So there's that particular exploded star. Now, it's pretty much going to stay that way through our lifetimes. So a lot of the planetary nebulas, even though a nova or supernova is fairly short-lived visually and even sometimes telescopically, the nebulas that are left behind can be there for several thousand years and show up very nicely in telescopes and as well as visually. So we're going to take a look at a couple more things here. So we haven't looked at any planets tonight. My telescope setup is primarily for looking at deep sky objects, but there are certain different types of telescopes and setups that you can use for Planetary. So we're going to go over and take a look at the planet Jupiter. So Jupiter is one of the brightest things that you'll see in the night sky. Venus would be slightly brighter, but there again, you'll need to get up about 3 in the morning to see that. So I took a very fast exposure, a fifth of a second. Here you'll see Jupiter and the 3 of the Galilean moons. If I step up the speed even more, you'll see the planet a little better. And there's the 3 of the Galilean moons. One of the moons may be in transit across or could possibly be behind it. And if we zoom in on my planetarium program, I'll have a look real quick here to see if that will tell me. I'm not sure if you can view that screen, this particular screen, or not. It looks like Europa is in transit across the face of Jupiter right now, so we won't be able to see that. But there's the large ball of Jupiter and 3 of the Galilean moons. So to see more detail, here is one case where the eye works much better than the camera. So if we were looking at Jupiter through the telescope, we would be able to see the cloud bands in much better detail and the surface in much better detail. So as I speed up the camera that I have, you can see that it shows a little better, but now it's very, very small, so it's a little tough to see. But through the telescope, you'll be able to see at least the equatorial cloud bands, and in some cases, depending on the scene conditions, and you'll be able to see 2 or 3, sometimes even 4 more cloud bands, the northern hemispheric bands as well as the southern hemispheric bands. But the equatorial bands are pretty much easily seen most of the time. So now we can go ahead and take a look at a nearby neighbor of Jupiter, and that would be the planet Saturn. And we'll take our picture here. And there you can see the little tiny dot right there. Looks a little bit egg-shaped. Notice it's much, much smaller. And it's a little bit dimmer, but if you look towards the Sagittarius area, you'll be able to see the bright planet Jupiter. And then just to the left of it a little bit, you'll see the planet Saturn. There again, the telescope setup I have with the camera I have doesn't show too much detail, but as you look through a telescope visually, you'll be able to easily see the rings around Saturn and maybe even some of the moons around Saturn. So it's always fun to look at the planets. Mars will not be coming up until later, so I guess we'll have to stop at this point in time because we're just about out of time here. But as you can see, oh, there looks like I'm showing up a few of the moons of Saturn as I increase the shutter speed. But obviously the planet pretty much goes away and just looks like a big egg-shaped thing. But you can definitely see the egg shape, just not any detail with the rings as you would through a telescope. So I certainly appreciate everyone spending some time with me. And you may be seeing this program during the day. You may be seeing it during the evening. If you're watching it during the evening, step outside and have a look up, and you'll see most of what we've seen tonight with a pair of binoculars or a small telescope. So this is J.D. Maddy with the Astronomers of Verde Valley, wishing everyone clear skies and keep looking up. Thanks for your time.